racism really became ingrained in American culture and in American law. And so the question earlier about how did you know who was a slave, there was the term slavery. Really, you were a slave if you were owned by somebody, but you were black as defined by the law. And so very early in Virginia in the 1660s, the colony had laws about who would be considered black, and it went farther back than your grandparents, to the point where there are people, I have a photograph taken in the 1860s after slavery had ended, and the caption says, former slaves. And when you look at it, most people's reaction is just shock, because there are children in that photograph who look to us as white children, but they were enslaved because they had some quantum of what they called black blood. And so racism, you see early on in Virginia, which was the first colony to really have enslaved people, distinctions being drawn between black and white, distinctions that said a white person who couldn't marry a black person, for instance. And so measures being written into the law to say that black people were inferior to white people, which is the root of white supremacy and racism. And the danger of it is that it affected those people, the black people, throughout the centuries of slavery, but it persisted even when slavery ended. And so you didn't just walk out of slavery and it was all over. There were stereotypes, there were myths, there were beliefs, there were structures in place that said black people are less than. And those messages, you know, it's been a long time, but those messages got conveyed over time.
Mm-hmm. Let me get Dante in here. What else would you add to that?
Well, I would like to add that there was a time in this country in the early to middle 1600s, when there was not much difference between an enslaved black person and an indentured servant. But as time evolved and the landed gentry and the people who were in the legislatures and passing the laws and so forth made a conscious decision that slavery would become a racial institution. There is a story of 3 indentured servants in the Chesapeake, Virginia area. 2 of them are white, 1 of them is black. The black man his name is John Punch. These 3 indentured servants work on the same farm, live in the same quarters, eat the same food, do the same work. They run off together. They're captured and brought back. The 2 white indentured servants are sentenced to several more years of servitude. The black man, John Punch, is sentenced to servitude for life. So we think of this as a turning point, 1640, when race is now becoming more and more a factor. And if you are white, you have privileges that black people, Africans, do not have.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Sloinus, how would you address the part of the caller's question that dealt with why Jewish people are not discriminated against today as opposed to black people?
Well, I would probably have a slight quarrel with the observation itself, because there does indeed appear to be, not only in the United States, but especially in Europe, Western Europe, perhaps in Eastern Europe, an upsurge of anti-Semitism, of anti-Jewish feeling, which is manifested in, you know, the vandalization of cemeteries, occasional acts of terrorism. It is involved, of course, in part, or grows out of present-day international politics in part. But on the other hand, it's also a manifestation of a very old hatred.
Gotcha. All right, we have another caller. We have Enrique from Duplin County. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes, my question is, what is the relationship between Zionism and racism, and why hasn't Africans on the diaspora received reparation and land like the so-called Jews of Israel, who received billions from the United States, plus military backing against the rightful landowners, who are the Palestinians?
Thank you, caller, for your question. Dr. Crow, do you have any response to that?
On Zionism and what was the other part? Why there are no reparations for
African Americans?
African Americans.
Yes.
Well, that's a very difficult question, and
Yes.
there's been a lot of debate on that, and there are actually groups out there who are promoting that at this point. It's not a question that has an easy answer. Certainly, the freedmen after the Civil War did not have a level playing field. They did not get the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised. And so they had to struggle through sharecropping, tenancy, discrimination, Jim Crow laws, and everything else to make a living. An argument could also be made that 600,000 people died in the Civil War to make them free. And all that treasure and blood was a huge down payment.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Hoffman, do you know of anyone, or did you and your family actually receive any sort of reparations for your experience?
Yes, I get a pension from the Austrian government. The German government responded to it much earlier than the Austrians did. And as a matter of fact, Professor Knight at one point found records within the Austrian parliament where in a session they said, look, let's not make a decision too rapidly. They're dying, they're slowly dying. So we didn't get our pension until about 8 years ago. As far as reparations are concerned for blacks, the last thing that I heard about it is that there was the court raised the question of whether the people who are today petitioning for it, whether they have real standing in the court. It's a formality.
Mm-hmm. Dante, do you have any knowledge of this?
In terms of, let me relay this back to the series.
Sure.
One of the things that we wanted to do in the series, hence the name of it, Slavery and the Making of America, was to acknowledge the many contributions that enslaved people made to the wealth and power that this country still enjoys today. Now, and to provide the American public and politicians with truth and information in that regard. Now, what the American public decides to do with that truth is going to be, I think, a very interesting situation, and is going to say something about this country coming to grips and coming to an understanding about the devastation of slavery and the contributions that the enslaved made, and where we want to go as a nation from here.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Williams, I saw you moving around in your seat.
It's
That's
just
okay.
such an interesting conversation. There's so many points. First of all, I wanted to say that you're right, standing and timeliness are barriers to civil lawsuits at this time. But I wanted to just point back to the 1890s. Dr. Mary Frances Berry has written an article, and will be giving a talk actually at UNC soon, about attempts to get access to reparations. And I noticed, Ms. Hoffman, you talked about having a pension, and that's what she was attempting to do. So she was going around the South trying to sign up former slaves. So this is while those people were still alive, and they were old, and they were poor, and they were destitute. She had no success. And so then people tried to get land. I mean, there were just all these actions, but I think it really goes back to something that Dante said a while back about freedom fighters, and you asked the question of why don't we know this? Why isn't this story told? And I think a big part of the problem is that slaveholders and people who supported them got to tell the history for a very long time. And I don't know how many of these students are interested in being historians, but it's really important that the role, the way that the story is told. And so you couldn't acknowledge freedom fighters because acknowledging resistance meant that there was something to resist, right? And so if you paint the story of slavery as a paternalistic institution where the white master takes care of his slaves who are inferior to him, why would anybody resist being taken care of? And so that's the story that gets told. And so then white Americans during slavery, and not all, I mean, there's an abolitionist movement, which there's also a resistance movement among non-Jews in Europe, and I think that's an important thing to talk about, that there are people who are part of, seemingly part of the oppressive group who stepped out of bounds and say this is really wrong. So that not all white people, but that people are able to believe, were able to believe, and can continue to believe that slavery wasn't so bad. What was there to resist, and why should anybody be compensated for that, even at the time when it would have been the same people? Yeah. But one more thing, I don't want to hog the time, but Dr. Crow made a reference to an argument being made that 600,000 people died for the freedom of black people, and that was a down payment. And I think it's really important, and part of the new history that's being, the revised history that's being written based on documentation, very careful work with sources, is that lots of those people were black men who enlisted in the war and so fought for their own freedom. And, you know, it's a whole debate about what the intentions of the Union were with regard to slavery, but that a lot of black people freed themselves. And before anybody said you're free, before anybody said you're welcome to come to the Union, they took off and they went. And so I just think it's debatable about that being a down payment.
I'm going to get back to you, Dr. Crow and Dr. Sloinis. I want to get you back in the conversation, but we've got a couple of questions in our audience. I'll come to you, sir. Yes.
Yes. I guess it's probably two questions. My question is, approximately during around 1860, how many African Americans totally, probably in terms of numbers in this country, and how many Africans that was transported totally in the Middle Passage or the transatlantic slave trade?
Thank you for your question. I'll get to you. Dante, can you answer that question?
Repeat that.
Okay.
How many African?
Yes, the first question was, how many African Americans were there in terms of numbers, census-wise, around 1860? And my second question is, a approximate total number of Africans who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Just a ballpark.
In terms of the population of African Americans in the 1860s, I cannot help you with that. Perhaps Heather can.
Dr. Crow, yes.
Well, there were approximately 4 million slaves in 1860. There were about 331,000 in North Carolina, which was about 1/3 of the population of North Carolina. As far as the Middle Passage goes, the estimates range as high as 11 million Africans being transported. Unless Dr. Williams has more recent figures, that's the one I've heard.
I think the most recent are about 11 to 12 who made it to the New World. And then there's a large proportion, some estimates as high as 1/3, who died during the transport to the coast and during the Middle Passage. But 12 million made it to these new destinations.
So there may have been as many as 4 million that died in the Middle Passage, is what you're saying? Okay. Let me get another question. Lucy? Yes.
Well, one of you was talking about non-Jewish people resisting the Holocaust. I haven't heard a lot about that, and I would like to.
Okay. Good question. Dr. Sloinis. She asked about non-Jewish people resisting the efforts of Hitler and the Nazis in the Holocaust.
Well, non-Jewish resistance. Most of those who would have been in the resistance, certainly the leaders were themselves in concentration camps. Places like Dachau. Anybody who was a Democrat, small d of course, liberal or socialist or to the left, all of that leadership was either in exile or placed into a concentration camp. You did have, ultimately, about some 20 attempts to assassinate Hitler. And, well, unfortunately, none of those succeeded. So there was, in fact, resistance, but it took place in the sort of a sea of conformity. Lots of people just, accepted what was going on when it would have been very important to be a resistor. One speaks of the Holocaust as they're having, victims, having perpetrators, and then finally, by far the largest group, bystanders, people who watch and know what's going on, or at least have an idea of what's going on, and do nothing. And the major lessons, I think, we have to maybe take from the bystanders.
Dr. Sloinis, where was America in all this? What would we qualify as? A bystander?
Well, in many respects, a bystander. Let me give you an example. Mr. Hoffman here from Austria came to England in 1939 as a child because of the British Parliament taking action simply to allow children who were in great danger